along the sunlit coastline of southern Florida, where the Atlantic stretches endlessly against a horizon that seems too perfect to question, there stands a structure that appears almost unreal in its beauty, an estate carved from ambition, polished by wealth, and wrapped in a silence that feels deliberate. From a distance, it reflects the dream of opulence at its highest form, sweeping arches, gleaming facades, and an atmosphere so carefully curated that it borders on theatrical. But the closer one looks, the more that perfection begins to feel less like an achievement and more like a disguise. Because beneath the polished surfaces and golden light, there lingers a quiet, persistent question. What exactly is being hidden here? At first glance, it is easy to accept the story at face value. A grand residence built to impress, designed to dominate its surroundings, and positioned as a symbol of success in a country that has long celebrated those who rise above the ordinary. Every detail seems to reinforce that narrative: the scale, the location, the unmistakable presence of wealth that turns architecture into statement. It is the kind of place that invites admiration before it invites understanding, where the visual experience alone feels sufficient to explain its existence. And yet, that explanation begins to feel incomplete the moment you consider how such places come to hold meaning beyond their walls. Because this is not simply a house. It is a space where influence gathers, where decisions echo far beyond the rooms in which they are made, and where the line between public reality and private intention becomes increasingly difficult to trace. Over time, it has attracted attention not just for what it displays, but for what it represents: an intersection of power, identity, and perception, all layered beneath a surface that rarely reveals its full story. And like many symbols that grow too large for their original purpose, it has begun to carry interpretations that conflict with one another, each one shaped by the perspective of those looking in from the outside. There's a certain tension in that contradiction. The same place that projects exclusivity and control also invites speculation and doubt. The same environment that appears carefully ordered suggests, in subtle ways, that something more complicated exists just beneath it. It is not a loud contradiction, not something that announces itself openly, but rather a slow realization that builds the longer one observes. A sense that what is visible is only part of a much larger narrative, one that unfolds quietly in fragments, through moments that do not always align with the image being presented. And that is where the fascination begins to shift. What initially appears as a story about wealth gradually becomes something more layered, more difficult to define. Questions emerge, not dramatic or immediate, but persistent enough to remain. Who truly benefits from such a place? What dynamics operate within it that remain unseen? And perhaps most importantly, why does it continue to draw attention in ways that go far beyond architecture or luxury? These questions do not offer quick answers, and that uncertainty is precisely what gives the place its enduring presence. It exists not just as a physical structure, but as an idea, one that reflects different meanings depending on who is observing it. For some, it stands as proof of success, a demonstration of what can be achieved through ambition and vision. For others, it suggests something more complicated, a reminder that the concentration of wealth and influence often carries consequences that are not immediately visible. Both interpretations exist at the same time, neither fully canceling the other out. And so, the estate remains suspended between those interpretations, never fully defined by any single narrative. It continues to function, to host, to exist within the rhythms of daily life, all while carrying a weight that extends far beyond its walls. People pass by, admire it, question it, and move on, but the underlying tension never quite disappears. It lingers in the background, shaping the way the place is perceived without ever fully revealing itself. Perhaps that is what makes it so compelling. Not what it shows, but what it withholds. Not the certainty of its image, but the ambiguity of its meaning. Because in the end, the most powerful symbols are rarely the ones that explain themselves completely. They are the ones that leave just enough unanswered to keep the story alive. Long after the surface has been understood, long before it became a symbol, debated across headlines and whispered about in political conversations, the estate began as something far more personal, an answer to a question that could not be solved with money alone. It is easy, looking at such a place now, to assume it was built simply because it could be. That wealth reached a certain scale, and architecture followed as a natural consequence. But that explanation feels too shallow, too convenient, because structures of this magnitude are rarely just about possession. They are about meaning, about proving something, not to the world at large, but to a very specific audience that may never fully acknowledge it. At the center of its origin was a vision shaped not just by resources, but by a quiet tension that existed beneath them. The kind of tension that comes from having everything that should grant entry into elite circles' wealth, influence, access, yet still sensing a boundary that remains just out of reach. It is a subtle form of exclusion, one that does not always announce itself openly, but instead reveals itself through tone, through distance, through the absence of true belonging. And it is precisely this kind of pressure that often produces the most extravagant responses. Because when acceptance cannot be earned in the usual ways, it is instead constructed deliberately, visibly, and on a scale that cannot be ignored. The decision to build was not impulsive. It was calculated, shaped by an understanding of how power and perception intertwine. Location mattered, not just for beauty, but for proximity to those who define status. Design mattered, not just for comfort, but for symbolism, every detail chosen to communicate permanence, taste, and authority. The structure itself became a statement, an argument expressed through materials and scale, suggesting that if entry into a world could not be granted, it could instead be redefined. That a new standard could be created, one that others would have to recognize, whether they accepted it or not. As the vision began to take form, it expanded beyond the idea of a private residence. It became something closer to a stage and environment where gatherings could be carefully orchestrated, where influence could be exercised not through direct confrontation, but through presence. The rooms were not just spaces. They were settings for interactions designed to shift perception. Invitations carried weight, not just socially, but symbolically, offering a glimpse into a world that was both exclusive and intentionally visible. And within those interactions, there was always an underlying objective: to move from the edges of acceptance to its center, to transform admiration into recognition. Yet, even as the structure rose, there was an inherent contradiction embedded within it. Because the very act of building something so grand to gain acceptance also risked reinforcing the distance it aimed to close. It drew attention, certainly, but attention is not the same as belonging. It can amplify presence while still preserving separation. And this tension between visibility and inclusion became part of the foundation itself, shaping not just how the estate was perceived, but how it functioned. Over time, that contradiction began to define the space as much as its physical form. The gatherings held within it carried a certain energy, one that balanced admiration with subtle judgment, invitation with quiet evaluation. It was a place where appearances mattered deeply, where impressions were crafted with precision, and where the line between authenticity and performance was often difficult to distinguish. Those who entered experienced its grandeur, but also sensed, perhaps unconsciously, the intention behind it, a desire not just to host, but to influence perception itself. And in that sense, the estate succeeded in ways that were both clear and ambiguous. It became impossible to ignore, a landmark that commanded attention and curiosity. It positioned itself firmly within the landscape of power and wealth, refusing to remain on the margins. But whether it achieved the deeper goal, the kind of acceptance that requires no effort to maintain, is far less certain. Because belonging, unlike architecture, cannot be constructed entirely from the outside. It is shaped by forces that do not always respond to scale or spectacle. What remains then is the imprint of that original ambition, still present within the walls, still influencing how the place is understood. Not just as a product of wealth, but as a response to something more complex, a need to be seen in a certain way, to occupy a space that extends beyond ownership into recognition. And even now, that origin continues to echo quietly, reminding anyone who looks closely that behind the grandeur, there was always a question being asked, one that may never have been fully answered. Time changes architecture in ways that are not always visible at first. Walls remain standing, materials retain their form, and the structure itself continues to project the same outward image. But meaning rarely stays still. Over the years, what was once built for a specific purpose begins to absorb new interpretations, shaped not only by those who use it, but also by the shifting world that surrounds it. The estate, once defined by a singular vision, gradually becomes something far more complex, a space where different eras leave behind competing layers of intent, each one altering how the place is understood. In its early phase, the estate functioned almost like a private statement, a carefully constructed environment designed to reflect a particular worldview. It represented control over space, over aesthetics, over who was allowed to enter and who remained outside. Everything within it served a clear intention, and its meaning was tightly aligned with the vision of its creator. At that stage, it was easier to read luxury as expression, architecture as identity, exclusivity as structure. But as time moved forward, the clarity of that original purpose began to blur. New occupants brought new priorities, and with them came subtle but important shifts. Spaces that were once purely personal became more performative. Rooms that once held private meaning were gradually repurposed into settings for visibility, where presence mattered as much as privacy once did. The estate stopped being just a reflection of one perspective and started becoming a platform where multiple influences converged. Each shift in use added another layer, not erasing what came before, but building over it in ways that created tension between past intention and present function. As the broader social environment evolved, so too did the way the estate was perceived. What was once seen primarily through the lens of exclusivity began to intersect with larger cultural conversations about wealth, access, and influence. The structure did not change physically in any dramatic sense, but its meaning expanded outward, shaped by external forces that redefined what it represented. In one era, it may have symbolized aspiration and achievement. In another, it began to reflect questions about inequality and separation. The same walls, the same spaces, now carried interpretations that often stood in contrast to one another. This transformation was not abrupt. It unfolded gradually, through moments that seemed minor in isolation, but significant in accumulation. A change in how gatherings were hosted, a shift in who was invited, a difference in how the space was presented to the outside world. All of these adjustments contributed to a slow redefinition of purpose. The estate became less about a fixed identity and more about adaptation, responding to the expectations and tensions of each new period it passed through. And in that process, it began to reflect not just the intentions of individuals, but the evolving structure of power itself. Because what changed outside its walls was just as important as what changed within them. Cultural attitudes toward wealth and visibility shifted, and with them came new scrutiny. Spaces like this were no longer seen in isolation. They were placed within broader narratives about privilege, access, and representation. The estate, once admired primarily for its scale and design, now existed within a more complicated framework of interpretation. It was no longer enough to observe what it looked like. People began asking what it meant, and more importantly, what it represented in a world that was becoming increasingly aware of its own divisions. Inside this evolving context, the estate became a kind of mirror, reflecting different truths depending on who stood in front of it. For some, it still carried the weight of admiration, a testament to ambition and the ability to shape reality through vision and resources. For others, it became a reminder of distance between those who inhabit spaces of influence and those who observe them from afar. Neither interpretation fully replaced the other, and that tension became part of its identity. The estate was no longer a singular story. It had become a collection of overlapping narratives, each one shaped by perspective rather than fact alone. Over time, even its function began to feel less fixed. It was no longer simply a private space or a symbolic landmark, but something in between, a hybrid of utility and representation. Events held within its walls carried different meanings depending on the moment, and each use contributed to its ongoing transformation. The estate adapted not through deliberate reinvention alone, but through continuous reinterpretation by those who engaged with it. It absorbed the pressures of changing expectations, reflecting the shifting balance between tradition and modern visibility. And so, what remains is not a single static identity, but a structure defined by evolution. Its transformation is not marked by one defining moment, but by the slow layering of time, influence, and perception. The estate stands as it always has physically, yet its purpose has never been more fluid. It exists within a space shaped as much by cultural tension as by architectural design, carrying within it the imprint of every era it has passed through and every meaning that has been projected onto it. There are moments in history when a place stops being just a place, when its physical structure remains unchanged, yet its meaning becomes unstable, pulled in different directions by forces far beyond architecture. The estate, once defined by its controlled elegance and private intent, eventually enters such a moment where visibility transforms into scrutiny and admiration quietly shifts into debate. What was once observed from a distance as a symbol of exclusivity begins to sit at the center of a far more complicated conversation, one shaped by power, perception, and political gravity. At first, the shift is subtle. Attention increases, but it arrives in fragments, news reports, public commentary, shifting interpretations that do not yet agree on what the estate represents. It is no longer enough to describe it in terms of luxury or design. Instead, it becomes part of a larger narrative, one where influence and access are no longer abstract ideas, but lived realities being questioned in real time. The estate is no longer just hosting events or preserving tradition. It is now being read as a signal, a statement, and sometimes even as evidence within broader arguments about how power operates. As this attention intensifies, the boundaries between private space and public meaning begin to blur. What happens within its walls is no longer contained by them. Every gathering, every presence, every association is interpreted through multiple lenses at once, each shaped by different expectations and suspicions. Some see continuity, a place where influence naturally gathers because it always has. Others see something more transactional, where proximity itself becomes a form of currency. These interpretations do not simply coexist. They compete, each one reinforcing a different understanding of the same physical reality. This tension transforms the estate into something far more volatile than it was designed to be. It is no longer just a backdrop for activity, but a focal point of disagreement. The same corridors that once symbolized control and exclusivity are now discussed in terms of access and accountability. The same spaces that were once defined by privacy are now examined through the lens of transparency. And with each new layer of attention, the estate absorbs additional meaning, not by choice, but by proximity to the forces that surround it. Political influence becomes part of that transformation, not as a single event, but as an ongoing condition. The estate exists within a network of relationships where visibility itself carries weight. Its name begins to circulate in discussions far removed from architecture or hospitality, entering conversations about governance, representation, and the boundaries between personal and public spheres. In this environment, neutrality becomes difficult to define. Even absence is interpreted. Even silence is questioned. The estate, by virtue of its prominence, becomes inseparable from the debates that surround it. Public scrutiny follows a similar trajectory, intensifying not because of one defining moment, but because of accumulation. Each layer of attention builds upon the last, creating a sense that the estate is no longer simply being observed, but analyzed. Its role is no longer passive. It is now expected to justify its existence within a broader cultural framework that is increasingly sensitive to symbols of power and privilege. And in this process, the estate becomes a projection surface where different groups place their own interpretations, often without agreement and sometimes without reconciliation. What makes this stage of transformation particularly complex is the absence of a single dominant narrative. Instead, there are overlapping stories, each one shaped by perspective rather than certainty. For some, the estate continues to represent continuity, a space where history and influence naturally converge. For others, it represents imbalance, a visible reminder of how access and privilege can concentrate within specific environments. Neither interpretation fully displaces the other, and it is within this unresolved tension that the estate takes on its most complicated identity yet. Even its physical presence begins to feel altered by this shift. Not in structure, but in perception. The same architecture now carries different emotional weight depending on who is viewing it. What once appeared as refinement may now be read as separation. What once signified prestige may now be interpreted as distance. The estate itself remains unchanged, but the meaning projected onto it becomes increasingly fragmented, shaped by external conversations that extend far beyond its boundaries. And so it exists in a state of continuous interpretation, where certainty is replaced by competing narratives. It is no longer possible to view it in isolation from the debates that surround it, because those debates have become part of its identity. The estate is now both subject and symbol observed, analyzed, and redefined repeatedly through the lens of public discourse. And in that transformation, it becomes something larger than its original purpose ever intended. Standing not just as a structure of luxury, but as a contested space within a much wider conversation about power, perception, and the meaning of influence itself. In the end, what remains is not a single definition, nor a final judgment, but a reflection that shifts depending on who's looking into it. The estate stands as it always has, physically unchanged in its structure, yet conceptually unstable, its meaning shaped less by its walls, and more by the world projecting itself onto them. It is here, at this point of reflection, that the story stops belonging to one narrative and begins to belong to many, each one revealing something different about the society that created it. From a distance, it can still appear as it once did, a carefully constructed space of order, control, and visual dominance. But distance has never been enough to understand it fully. Because closer inspection reveals not simplicity, but layering decades of interpretation, adjustment, and redefinition that have turned it into something far more complex than its original form. It is no longer just an estate, and it was perhaps never only that. It has become a surface onto which broader tensions are projected, absorbed, and reinterpreted endlessly. Within its reflection, one can see divisions that extend far beyond its physical boundaries. Questions of access and exclusion, of visibility and invisibility, of influence and separation, all seem to converge within its presence. It does not create these tensions, but it reveals them with unusual clarity. And in doing so, it becomes less a cause and more a mirror, reflecting the conditions of the society that continues to define it through competing interpretations. For some, that reflection still carries a sense of admiration. It represents ambition taken to its most visible form, a reminder that vision and resources can reshape physical space into something commanding and unforgettable. In this reading, the estate is not a problem to be solved, but a result to be acknowledged, a demonstration of what is possible when intent and capability align without constraint. It stands as evidence of aspiration made material, a rare instance where imagination is translated into enduring form. For others, however, the same reflection carries discomfort. It highlights the uneven distribution of access, the concentration of influence within specific spaces, and the distance between those who inhabit such environments and those who observe them from afar. In this interpretation, the estate becomes less about achievement and more about contrast. It draws attention not only to what it contains, but to what exists outside of it, what is included, and what is left beyond its boundaries. And it is in this contrast that its symbolic weight deepens. What makes the estate so enduring in public consciousness is not that it resolves these perspectives, but that it holds them simultaneously without closure. It does not settle into a single identity that can be agreed upon universally. Instead, it remains suspended between interpretations, each one shaped by the viewer's own understanding of power, privilege, and belonging. This suspension is not accidental. It is what allows the estate to persist as a point of reference in broader cultural conversations. It becomes a structure that does not answer questions, but reflects them back. Over time, this reflective quality has only intensified. As society itself becomes more divided in how it understands wealth, access, and influence, the estate absorbs those divisions into its symbolic presence. It does not move or change in any fundamental way, yet its meaning expands outward, shaped by discourse that grows increasingly complex. It becomes less about what it is and more about what it represents in the minds of those who interpret it. And perhaps that is where its true significance lies, not in a final explanation, but in its ability to remain unresolved. It resists closure because the questions surrounding it are not static. They evolve alongside the society that continues to project them onto its surface. Every generation that engages with it finds something different to see, something different to question, something different to debate. And in that ongoing reinterpretation, the estate becomes less a fixed story and more a living conversation. There is no final perspective that can fully contain it, no single narrative that can settle its meaning once and for all. It exists instead as a space of reflection, one that absorbs contradiction rather than resolving it, and one that continues to reveal more about the viewer than the viewed. In the end, the estate stands not as an answer, but as a reminder that symbols of power are never truly singular in meaning. They are shaped continuously by perception, divided by interpretation, and sustained by the very uncertainty they create.